Hello guys, welcome to another day for JavaScript tutorial. In this part 2 series, we're going to complete the build with our JavaScript implementation. Now, if you didn't watch part 1, where we built this using HTML and CSS, I highly recommend you go back and watch that. If you don't want to spend time on CSS and just want to dive deep in the HTML and follow along with us, just head to our GitHub repo and clone this to your local machine and you'll be where we left off in the previous video. So this is what we're going to be implementing in our build: the board and the logic, as you can see in the final build of the game, knowing when it's a draw, when it's a win, and all those kind of scenarios. It's going to be very interesting, and I'm going to do my best to explain most or everything that I can do for you to understand how we're going to use JavaScript to accomplish this. If it's not clear, then always reach me out in the Slack channel where I'm always active. Send me a message, ask me questions. I'll be more than willing to help out. All right, without further ado, let's get started. So in the previous video, we looked at how we implemented this using HTML and CSS. We also looked at how we use CSS variables to store properties that we'll be using or sharing with other elements in our CSS. So now that we have this, let's look at how we're going to start with the JavaScript. Okay, great. Now to our JS part, JavaScript part. So if we look at our final build here, we see a board of 8 squares. Yes. And within our board, of course, we have this text and all these kind of zeros and x's that play, and then you get to see was won, was drawn, and so on and so forth. So the first thing we're going to do, the first thing we always do in JavaScript, we always want to first access our DOM elements from our HTML file. So if we go back to our HTML file, we see that we have a couple of them. We have our heading, we have our strategy, we have our restart, and we have, most importantly, the one we're going to start with, our square for now. Don't focus on the board, we'll come to the board later, and let's focus on the square. We want to first draw our board just like you see here, right here. So first thing we do is first want to access So as you saw them, we had our heading, strategy, restart, and most importantly, the square. So after knowing the elements we want to access in our JavaScript file, we now decide on the method we want to use, the API method you would call it. So you can either use get element by ID or query selector, but query selector is a bit newer than the element ID and can perform more complex functions compared to the ID, but you can use the get element by ID if you wanted, right? But in this tutorial, in this build, we're going to use the query selector to select our IDs and our classes. And this is how we use them. So we're using this query selector all here because if you look in our HTML, we have over 8 divs that share the same class. So this does not need to be unique as in our IDs, but if you have something that you're going to share, you have an ID that is going to be shareable, you prefer to use a class rather than an ID. Now that we have our square pinned down, let's get the heading, the strategy, and the restart. When you're using query selector, always start with a hashtag and then the name of the element. I'm going to speed this up. Okay, now we have our squares. This one. We have our strategy. Strategy is where we'll show the text. If we go to our build here, if you look closely below the above the restart button, where you see who has won, how, that's where our strategy text will go. X or O has won, diagonally, horizontally, in the middle, so on and so forth. Our heading, you're going to see, you'll see that our heading will have a condition. If X has won, then change X has won, then H2. Our strategy here will have how they have won, the method of how they have won, how have they won horizontally, vertically, and so on and so forth. Our restart button, of course, have the restart, click restart, and that's pretty much it, as you can see here. So we have our elements selected. Now next thing we want to do is we want to draw the board. So next thing we want to do is write a function that draws the board. So now that we have our elements, how are we going to do that? All right, now before we do that, before we start to plan out how we're going to write this function, I forgot to tell you that a query selector always returns an array of the elements. So console log here our squares and check our console in the web. Let's do this. Oh well, from the problem wasn't just a small mistake. I had forgotten to link my script with my HTML. So please, things happen. Don't ever forget. First thing you do, always connect your script tag, your JavaScript file to HTML. Otherwise, you look like a fool. So always connect your JavaScript first. So as you can see in the console, we have a node list that points to an array of our divs that have square, bound, so on and so forth. The same thing you see here from 0 to 8. So with this in knowledge, we can now create a simple function that loops through our array. Okay, so here are some of the conditions we want our loop to follow when it's looping through our array, and it's pretty basic. If we get our pencil here, and it simply says if you're going through the array and the index position is less than 3, meaning that 0, 1, 2, draw a border bottom. Let me erase this. Draw a border bottom. Yes, it passes that. And then we give it another condition that if the index position are all divisible by 3 and there's no remainder, which we have 6 and 3 in our array, then add a border right to the table, and then it keeps looping. And then when you add another condition saying if the index are divided by 3 and then there's a modular, there's a remainder of 2, then add a border left. See, and then finally its final loop, if you keep looping through and then the index position is greater than 5, that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then add a border top to the table, and we get our table, as you can see in the illustration here. So that's the condition we're going to give our function, drawboard function. We're going to use a for loop. The reason why we're going to use a for loop, it allows us to create a callback function within our loop, within our function, which also allows us to pass in parameters to make it easier for us to pass these conditions and styles. So if this is not clear yet, I recommend you go back and watch it again as I explain it. I'm pretty sure it's going to make more sense when we are writing the code. Okay, we're done. Let's get this out of the way and start coding. Okay, so let's start with the drawboard function. Just before I move forward, I realized I'd made a mistake. We are going to use a for each loop, not a for loop, to iterate through our array. So we already have our conditions we want to pass, but the question is, how are we going to pass the styles in JavaScript? Well, we're simply going to use the .style method in JavaScript that allows us to pass CSS to our JavaScript. So let me show you how we're going to do that. This is where we're going to pass in our for each loop. Squares is the one that has the array. Now for each loop takes in 2 to 3 parameters, and the first parameter is the value, and then the second one is the index of the array. And if you also notice, VS Code always gives you snippets to read through and to try and understand the function itself. So this is where we're going to create our styles and append our CSS styles using JavaScript. So let's create a variable here. This can name it anything. Notice we're using camel case naming convention. Now this is where we are going to start our conditions. Let's start with the first one. As we see here, we're saying that if the index of the array is less than 3, add a style sheet of border bottom 3 pixel solid text. But how are we going to add this? How is JavaScript going to know? Because JavaScript does not know CSS. CSS is CSS. So with the dot style method in JavaScript, we're able to push those styles to CSS. And this is how we do it. Simply call the value in the array and then equate it to our variable. Now when we call our drawboard function, we should be able to see a border bottom of the specified values you wanted. And there you have it. So I hope that was clear and it did not confuse you. And by now you should be able to understand what this is. We're simply using the variables we predefined in our CSS file in the previous video right here. And if you change it, it will change accordingly, as you can see right there. Okay, so now let's finish up all these remaining conditions, which are pretty much the same, just changing the side of the border where you want a border really. And then finally, and there we have our board on our web page looking similar to our final build. Great. All right. Now that we have finished our board, let's see what else we can do in this build. If you go to the finished build here, see that when you click on the square, you get the current player values. That's O circle, O and the X, O and the X, vice versa. So let's create a function that displays our current player. If it's a O, then it displays the current player, which is O. Then if it's an X, it displays the X, and so on and so forth and so on. We're not going to write the function of winning and drawing right now. What we're going to simply do is just write a simple function that displays our current players. Let it be O or X respectively. So let's come below this function. And I'm going to put some comments that you'll read through and help you out. Okay, so I've put a few comments you can read through to make you understand what we're going to do. What I'm simply saying that we are going to simply write a function that displays our current player value, let that be O or X when its square is clicked, and then we pass the function in the Drawboard function within the for each loop for it to recognize which ID or square is being clicked. Okay, let's just close this. And now we're going to define a few variables we're going to use for our function. So the first one we're going to define is the square spaces variable. Now this is where we'll populate our IDs as it iterates through the for each loop, as you'll see. And then we're going to create two variables, one for the circle and one for the X. These will be our current player values. And now by default, let's assign or as a default value to our current player. And these are the variables that are going to help us write our function. Okay, now let's start with the square spaces. Now below this comment, let me collapse it. This is where we're going to write our squares clicked function. To take in an event as a parameter, and then this is an event we're going to determine the ID, or we're going to target the square of a specific of the board. Create an ID, then assign it the e.target.id value. Now let's see if this works. Let's pass our function as I stated here within our for each loop in the drawboard function. Add an event listener. Then our function. Now if we console log our ID, we should be getting the ID of the specific div in our drawboard. Okay, now if we check our console, we should be seeing a node list, of course, and then when we click each individual square, we should be getting the ID of that square based on the index array indexes in the array index position. So you can see we're getting a specific ID of that div, of that specific div in the array. So that's why it's crucial that you pass the function within the for each loop for it to iterate through each individual square to know the ID which ID is being selected on, and for it to know that this is the index position I am at, and knows what to do when it's at that position. So keep that in mind. So now that we know we have the IDs of specific squares by clicking on, you can simply create an if condition that simply says if the square is empty, assign it our current player, which by default we assigned it letter O. So let's write that if condition. ID assign it our player, but that's not going to display it, of course, because let me show you. So you can clearly see nothing is happening, but if you console log our square spaces, you're going to notice something very special. Now let's go back to our console here, and now let's click the individual square. Now you see if we click on the individual square, you see that the current player is being displayed. As you can see, and it's displaying 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, but you don't see it on the web page specifically. So how do we display it for the user to see that? So we simply use the inner text to display the current player. Simply call that target. Now when you click on the square, you see that it is actually displaying on the screen. Awesome.
So now we have our current player showing. How do we now switch between O and X, the different variables we have here? How do we switch between O and X to show a real life feel of like two a multiple game, like you're playing against two people? So with that, we're simply going to use the ternary operators. If you're not familiar with that, I suggest you watch my JavaScript tutorial for beginners talking about operators in JavaScript. So for that, we're simply just going to call our current player variable and say if current player is equal to this default, then just display make sure it's the same spelling as your variables, otherwise it won't work. Otherwise, let's stick to our default. So if we save this, we should be getting the switch between O and X, O and X, so on and so forth. As you can see, they are switching, and great. Let's remove this console log. I'll just comment it out for you to play around with. So there we have it. We have simply created our function that displays our current player value depending on the square we're clicking on. And if it's a O, we then toggle to X, and if it's a X, we then switch back to O, so on and so forth. Now let's go to the next bit, which is creating a function that tells us that specific player has won in this way, on that way, and see how we're going to do that. The next stage is a bit complex, but I'm going to try to make it simpler for you to understand. So I hope you understand. And if you don't understand, you can rewatch it again or ask me in the Slack channel, J for JavaScript. All right. Okay, now to our very interesting part of this build, creating functions, a function that is going to show us which player has won in what way and in which way. I've listed a descriptive comment for you to read through when you check it out on the Git repo to make it very easy for you to understand. And I'm going to explain everything here to really paint a picture in your mind. So what I'm simply saying here, we're just going to write a simple function that will determine all possible ways our players will win. And now to make it simpler or to make it kind of digestible, the only thing we have to take note of is the constant index position that is not going to change. Yes, so if we look at these beautiful diagrams I got and go through them, you're going to notice that the constant index position here that does not change is the 0 position, as you can see. And these are possible ways our players can win. They can either win on top, as you can see here, winning on top. You can either do it using on the index of 0, 1, 2, or on the left 0, 3, 4. Sorry, this was supposed to be 6. Yes, 0, 3, 6, or diagonally 0, 4, 8, or vice versa. So if we go to our final build and we do exactly that, let's say I play this first, then X plays here, then I play here next, then our X plays here, then I play here. You can see the strategy text, which we're also going to take advantage of, as I've said here, would show us how we have won the game, in which strategy. Have we won the game by winning on top, left, winning on left, and by left I mean if I click here and then my X player clicks here, then I click here, then my X player clicks here, then I click finally win the game. You will see that it shows that your player has won on the left. Same for diagonally. Play this, play here, play this, play here, play this, play there. So all these are possible wins you can get using based on the zero index. As you can see, it's a constant, it's not changing. I hope that's making sense, because if you know that there's a constant position that is not changing, regardless of how you're playing the game, vice versa, if you're starting from 8, then you're making your way to top of 0, you still win diagonally. Okay, then we see the next constant index, which is of 8, which is around here. This is also a constant, it does not change, and possible wins we can get from our constant position of 8 is winning on right, like this, or winning on the at the bottom, which is right here. If we go back to our build again and then do the same game, then play here, play here. Oh, our current player has won without us noticing. All right, let's do that again. Play here, then our X plays here, then this one plays here, plays here, plays here, then our X plays here, and then you see X wins on the right. Those are the possible chances or constant position of 8 we can win. We can also do it vice versa, starting from the bottom, heading up to the top. And this is our picture. As you can see, these are the two possible outcomes we can get from our constant index of 8. We can either win at the bottom or at the right. And then we go to our last position, which you just saw is winning diagonally again. If we go to the build, our picture here, as you can see, 2 4 6, vice versa, you can do it from the bottom up. But our constant, remember, if you know our constants are the ones that are not going to change, and our constants are 0 8 4, they're always going to be there, and makes it easier for us to come up with scenarios, winning scenarios. So we know that 4 is not going to change, and it's going to be the constant index position, that all possible wins could come from that position. So we have 2 4 6 winning diagonally. As you can see, you can either go like this or 6 4 2 to win the game diagonally. Let's do that right here. So if we, let's just restart this for a moment. So if my player plays there, I play here, my player plays here, I play here, and he plays here, and I play here, you can see I have won diagonally from the 2 4 6 index positions. And then we have a winning vertically, which is in the middle. This is a 1 4 1 4 7. As again, we can play the game, plays here, plays here, plays here, plays here, and then wins vertically in the middle. Then finally, you can win horizontally in the middle. If he plays here, then I play here, he plays here, then he plays here, then I play here. I win the game horizontally in the middle. So all those are winning scenarios. Our two players can win on the left, right, bottom, top, middle, and horizontally in the middle. So knowing that we have three constants that do not change, and that's our 0, our 8, and our 4, makes it easier for us to come up with the scenarios. As I said here, then we'll take advantage of our strategy text, which we already got from our HTML. Yes, we're going to manipulate the text according to how our players won. Then finally, we pass our function back to our squares clicked here for it to show us the necessary steps. I hope that made sense. Now let's write the function. Let me collapse this. Let me write it below here, and hopefully this will make sense. Okay, so now let's write our function, but let's start bit by bit. Let's open up our comment here. Let's start with winning on top first. So how are we going to write a function? How is it going to know that, okay, this player has won on top, and how do we display that specific text to the users playing? So let's write our function here. So let us call it player1. And now this is where we're going to pass in our condition. So since we already have the square spaces, we simply target the position, the index position. And since we said 0 is the constant, so we simply say put a comment for you to understand. Zero is equal to our current player. Then what are the two possible scenarios that our player can play for them to win on top? Since we're starting with a winning on top, so we have the index 1 and 2. Again, position. So it's just checking that if position 0 equals to current player, and then if spaces 1 is equal to the current player and then the 2 is the same player as it's switching, then return the message, and which we're going to use the strategy text we already accessed in from our HTML. Let's use the backtick literals. We are using backtick literals here because the current player is always changing, and we have two variables, that's the X and the O. Simple strings cannot simply know that. That's why we're using the backtick literals for you to know the actual current player that is winning on top. Then you can add in your custom text. So if we save this, as again I told you, we have to return. Don't forget to return. Have to pass the function in the squares clicked function above. So if our players one on top, we are going to also manipulate the text here. Again, we already got it from our HTML using the DOM element, and say that so and so player has won. Again, back to glitches. Make sure you call the function, otherwise it won't work. So now let's see what happens. And you can see, oh, sorry, this is the build. Let's go to the actual build we are working on. Now you see there's a problem. Let's fix it. So make sure your return statement is in the right braces. Okay, so let's try again. So we play up here, X plays there, O plays there, X plays there, and boom. So we have covered our first scenario of O winning. As you can see, this text has been changed. If we go back to our function here, this is one we used. We created a condition. If player has won, then do this. Change the text to this, to the current player, and then in the player one function itself has the conditions, necessary conditions that will manipulate the strategy text on how the player has won. And if you see closely up here, we have covered all the possible scenarios. If we open this, of winning on top, as you can see right here. Okay, so now let's cover the rest of winning on left and diagonally based on the zero index, constant index. I hope it's making sense. If it's not, you can watch it again and listen to the explanation I made before and try again. Okay, so now it's just checking for the two positions, and now that is 3 and 6, since 0 is the already constant index position. So simply repeat what we've done and just change the text accordingly. So now we know that 036 gives us a winning on the left. Save this again. Please don't forget to return, because you're not comparing, you're just simply checking. So you must return to true, otherwise it will break and we'll just keep calling the function and yeah, just mess up. So if we save and try this again, as you can see, all wins game on left. Nice. So we have the left covered. Now what we're remaining with is the diagonally, the position of winning. Yes, diagonally. So we have to cover 0, 4, and 8. So it's pretty much the same. You now must be familiar with it now. Let's just get this. It's really the same. Nothing is changing apart from the text. So save some time. If we save and try it out again, you see that winner or wins the game diagonally. So that's pretty much it, as we stated descriptively in the comments. So now that we know we have covered all winning scenarios of O, we're now going to cover the same for position 8. And we do the same thing. We just repeat. So really repeat the same process I've done simply for you. I've just added comments above for you to know where the 0 position ends, where the 8 starts, and where the 4 starts. It's just the same really. So follow through. I'm pretty sure you can do it now. Just get the constant position, check it, compare it with the current player, and then return the appropriate strategy in a text. And this description is pretty much helpful. And yes, so now that we have all our logic as we started before, now let's work on the draw functionality. Let's write a function that if it's a draw, as you have seen here, it simply says that the game is a draw. Okay, so I hope that was fun for you to try out and to get your hands dirty. And I highly recommend you watch this again if it's not been clear for you to, to really drill it in your mind and understand it. Okay. Okay, let's look at our draw function. So our draw function will simply match all squares. If all squares are filled, then simply return a draw. So we'll also use it for each loop here. After writing our function, we'll pass it to the squares click function above here, be called, as we have seen, player 1, and then that's pretty much it. Now we're going to iterate through our square spaces. Let's write the function now. This is the number we're going to keep incrementing through our squares. If it iterates through our array and reaches the number, which is 9, then it simply returns a draw. And this is our function. If the squares are all full and are not empty, then keep incrementing the number here by 1, and then if it reaches the maximum number of elements in the array, we'll simply return draw. Let's call it here in the squares clicked function. So now let's try it out and see if it works. And as you can see, it's a draw up there. Our text has been manipulated to show that we have drawn, and our draw function works. Now let's work on our function that enables us to restart. When you click on the button restart, or that restarts every after 2 seconds or 1 second. And finally, to our last function, the restart function. Now, as I've added these comments before, our restart function will simply reset all our values to default. And if you look at the CodePen build, you notice there's a slight delay before our game restarts, and that was possible by the set timeout function. But in our current build here, I'm not going to add it in. But if you want to see how I did that, you can check out the CodePen link and see how I added the set timeout function. In this build, I simply want us to restart only and only when we click the restart button. So we don't need a set timeout function for that. But if you want to add it there, by all means, you can do that. So with this function, we're simply going to create it and then attach it to our button using an add event listener of click, and then simply call our restart function just above our drawboard. And again, we'll iterate through our squared arrays, squared spaces using the for each. You can also use a for loop if you want. Please make sure this is not squared, this is square spaces. So otherwise your application will break. First thing we want to do is return all the index positions in our square spaces to now, and then do the same for our squares. Squares, I mean this what we have here, our array we have in our squares. Also do the same, reset it with the inner text to an empty string. Do the same for our strategy text, the h2, and then our text, which is the head one. We return it to play when it says O or X as 1. Let's return it to play when we click on the restart function or when we click on the restart button. And that's pretty much it. Now we have to add this function to our button, as I said before, right here, our restart button. It's added below here. And finally call our restart function. So now let's try it out. As you can see, it's a draw, but if we click our restart button, everything is taken back to the default state. So very, very smooth and works as we wanted it to work. Let's see it in full display. Again, X as 1. If you press the restart button, everything is restarted as expected. And there you go. We have come to an end of this interesting and very, very fun build of our JS part of the Tic Tac Toe. I hope you have enjoyed it, you have learned something, and I hope you are in our group Slack community J for JavaScript. If you're not, you can check in the description below and join our community now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and a shout out to you, Sandy Duran, who requested this build. Do not worry, I'm going to send all the changes, commit all the changes to the GitHub repo. So if you check the GitHub in the description below. You'll find all the necessary changes and updates for you to play around with and do anything you want to your JS build. Without saying much, thank you for watching. Keep learning and see you in the next one. Bye.